Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to TacticalBassin. Today, talking springtime jerkbaits. We're going to talk about a two-pronged approach to jerkbait fishing, and then we're also going to talk soft jerkbaits as well. Springtime is prime time with the jerkbait. There's a variety of reasons for that, but the biggest thing, it's something we've talked about before, but the biggest thing is the jerkbait's ability to trigger a reaction out of a bass. It is probably the single best bait ever made for triggering a core response. More importantly, in springtime, bass are schooling, and triggering a response in one bass can trigger an entire school of bass. And that is why the jerkbait is so incredibly deadly. If you're not throwing a jerkbait in the spring, 100% you're missing the boat. I don't care where you live. I don't care how big your fish are. It applies to you. The jerkbait in one shape or form or another is a must-have springtime bait. It catches absolutely giant fish. Now, right off the bat, I mentioned a two-pronged approach. What I want to talk to you about is the two very different ends of the spectrum with jerkbaits. Little tiny baits, giant baits. Because in the springtime, I don't fish anything in between. I fish the two farthest ends of the spectrum. I want those big giant baits and I want small baits. So, starting with big giant baits, then we'll work down to the little ones. Springtime is one of your best shots to get that monster bite. So what I do is I start out throwing a giant bait. Something like the Megabass Canada. I mean, that's a big bait. Those are number 2 treble hooks on that bait. It's big. I mean, compare that. For size comparison, here's a Jackal Re-Range 110. I mean, it's massively bigger. The trick, though, with the Canada is that it's skinny. So it doesn't present itself as a giant bait in the water. Another one is that Re-Range 130. That guy right there. Again, a very large bait. Compared to a Canada, it's small. Compared to everything else, it's huge. Lucky Craft Pointer 128 is a bait that I threw for years and years and years. But these two baits have all but replaced it for me. Then the other one would be that Megabass Division 110 Magnum, the bigger one. Those are all fantastic options. You cover water with that thing. Springtime, I'm aggressive. Whether the water is clear or murky, I fish those baits hard. I mean, really rip them. Cadence is everything with a jerkbait. You don't want to overwork them. You don't want to underwork them. So I use either a 1, 2, or 3 rip. Like rip, pause. Rip, pause. Rip, pause. Mix them up, either 1, 2, or 3. But here is the biggest mistake that I see people make when fishing a jerkbait. Hands down, the number one mistake that people make. We noticed it when we started watching our own underwater jerkbait footage. If you're ripping that jerkbait and it just cut, and it just pauses, and then cut, pauses, cut, pause, those fish just come up and blast that thing. But if it cuts, and then swims a little, and then cuts, they want nothing to do with it. So the biggest tip I can give you for jerkbait fishing, springtime or otherwise, when you rip that bait, you rip, and you're reeling up your slack, you never reel up all the slack. You always leave a little bit of slack on the water. So I rip, and I actually turn the handle while I'm ripping to take up some of my extra line. Rip. When I go to take my slack out, I don't actually pull my line tight before the next rip. That's not what I do. I throw it out, I reel up 80 or 90% of the slack, and then my first jerk or rip of that rod tip is going to rip through the slack and then hit the bait. So the first 6 inches or a foot of that pole is actually on slack line before it even snaps tight. The reason why is that if I do that, if I stop early, that bait's sitting there, then that line snaps tight and it jerks. Versus just reeling, accidentally reeling too much, and that jerkbait gets a little wobble before it goes. The fish are not interested in that. I don't know why. I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you it's the way it works. So you want that hard cutting, hard stop, hard cut. That is the key. Now back to those big baits. Don't be afraid to work them hard. I mean, really rip those baits. And then long pauses. Rip, 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 pause. Completely dead. Rip, rip, pause. But if it's not happening, slow it down. Twitch, twitch, kill it. Twitch, kill it. But I always start out with the big baits because I'm trying to catch the biggest fish that I can. So here's my mentality. I throw the biggest bait that I can get away with. If they eat it, I stick with it. If they won't eat it, it's not working, I don't worry about the middle. I go all the way to the little baits. The biggest bait that I throw is that Jackal re-range. The 110 though, compared to that 130. Night and day different. Much, much smaller profile bait. So that 110 is the biggest bait. And you guys know, a year ago we discovered this re-range and I absolutely fell in love with it. It is one of my top 2 or 3 jerkbaits of all time. The thing is amazing in both sizes, but especially that 110. It is so deadly. So that's as big as we go. Flash pointer is right there with it. Flash pointer is actually a 115, but their profile, truly, truly identical. They fish the same way. The re-range might go 6 inches to a foot deeper on a long cast. It has a different transfer system, so I get a longer cast out of it, and I end up getting a little deeper. Other than that, profile-wise, identical. From there, we just go small. We go to either, what was on the end of that rod? I go to either the Flash Pointer 100, which is a little tiny bait. Right here, let's get some size comparison going. That Kanata Flash Pointer 100, tiny bait. The other ones are going to be, if I need to go deep, I go to a Stacy 90. Everything else is shallow, or a Pointer 78. And the one that I've been playing with lately, I'm always trying new things, is this little Abyss, little Damiki bait, but it plays literally in the exact same category as a pointer. It just goes a little bit deeper. That's the only difference that I've been able to find. In terms of action, everything else exactly the same. Now, why am I going to a tiny bait? Why do I go from a huge Kanata down to a little tiny Pointer 78? What's the deal? Well, here's the concept. When the bass move into the shallows, the giant females, they tend to hold out and the males come up first. But then the females come in and they join them before the spawn, and then they ultimately spawn. So the giant bait, I'm trying to catch those huge females on their own, just independently catch them. If it doesn't work, I drop down to that little bait, because the goal is, they're going to school together. The goal is to trigger any fish in the school. I do not care which one. I can catch a 10-inch bass in a school of bass, and that school has a 9-pounder in it. If I catch the 10-incher, and then I throw back in, I catch the 2-pounder, throw back in, 2-pounder, throw back in, 4-pounder, throw back in, 10-incher, throw back in, 9-pounder. The key is to fire up the entire school of fish, to get them triggered, to get a core response, and to rev them up. And that big bass that's in the middle of them will get caught up in the commotion, she'll get caught up in the excitement, and all of a sudden, you end up with a giant bass on a little tiny, tiny bait. Little number 6 trebles. And it works. It works. The biggest fish I've caught on a jerkbait is a 12-pounder, and it was not on a big jerkbait. It was on a little jerkbait. I had a client recently stick a 998. How close is that to a 10-pounder? 998 on a little tiny jerkbait, because you're triggering the school, and then you're luring that core reaction out of the biggest fish in the school, and then you've got them. Now, when we're talking about catching big fish on little jerkbaits, gear is everything. It's so critical that your gear be set up properly. Stock hooks are a no-go. You guys already, you've seen it in videos before. We talk all the time about how much we change hooks. And little Aaron Martin's Finesse Nano Treble is the hook that I use for jerkbaits. I mean, guys, I'm serious about changing out treble hooks. I have so many of them. You need to pair them to the baits, but typically if you carry size 6, size 5, and size 4, that will cover almost all of your baits, almost everything. Because you want to keep a jerkbait balanced. You want it to be either a true suspending bait or ultra slow fall or ultra slow rise. As close to suspended as you can get makes a big, big difference. And then with these little tiny baits, again, cadence is everything. A lot of them, I work them super hard, like flash pointer. I rip that thing hard, really, really work that bait. Get a ton of flash, a ton of movement out of it. That re-range, I don't have to hit that one quite as hard, just to snap. Just snap that rod tip. Because this bait has an incredible amount of roll and flash. Huge amount of flash comes off the side of that bait when it rolls over. So I don't work that one as hard. That Abyss, that little guy, I work it ultralight. Just a little pop, 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 pop. If I overwork it, it kind of blows out. But if I work it gentle with short, sharp snaps, it's very darty, side to side. Very, very darty. Stacy 90, short little snaps. Really reactive. Any bait that has that big bill, you don't want to over rip them. Because if you over rip them, they start to swim almost like a crankbait. And you don't want that. You want that bill to catch water and roll. Either left or roll right. Doesn't matter, right? You're just trying to get movement. But if you pull too hard, it'll balance out and it'll kick and swim, and that's terrible. So short little snaps is the way to work any bait that's got a big bill, including the Stacy 90. And then your other baits are just somewhere in the middle. Experiment with them. Some of them you can really hit them hard, get a super aggressive bite out of those fish. And then your rods are key. I've told you guys my favorite rod, that X-Pride. It's a 6'10" medium, is the best jerkbait rod I've ever owned at any price. I do pair it with an Aldebaran, which is a very pricey reel. It's a pricey combo, but I jerkbait fish a lot. And like I said, my goal when I jerkbait fish is not to catch little fish. I catch a lot of little fish, but my goal is to catch giants, and you need to have perfect equipment when you tie into a giant. That's why I invest so heavily in my jerkbait rod. But budget is different for everybody. I mean, even in that exact rod, you can step down to a Zodius. Literally the exact action, the exact rod, everything exactly the same. Just weighs just a touch more, and you save a bunch of money when you go to a Zodius. And I throw that on a Corrado 70. It works phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It's a great combo and is like half the price, honestly. And then if you're really budget conscious and you don't want a dedicated jerkbait rod, it's just something you do part of the year, or you're not that worried about it, you can actually get away with throwing a jerkbait on a lot of rods. Almost any crankbait rod will do it. The key to fine tuning that jerkbait bite is to have a limber rod once you hook up, but it's a limber rod with a fast tip. And that is hard to find. That's why that rod is so good. Both of those rods are so good. Is that it's got that crisp tip, so you can snap that bait and get that darty movement, but load up on a big fish on size 6 trebles, and it'll still really bow up, and you don't pull those fish off. So when you go to a crankbait rod, you compromise. You lose that snappy tip. It's more of a moderate action, but it still looks good. It's not perfect, but it looks good. And you can get into a crankbait rod like, the cheap Dobbins. You're into that rod, that 7 foot, medium heavy. It works for a jerkbait, no problem. You're into that rod, $79, and it's a good jerkbait rod. I've caught big fish on that rod and haven't pulled the hooks. You lose that little bit of snappiness. So like a bait like the Abyss, it's gonna be harder to work, or a Stacy 90 is gonna be a little harder to work. But like a Jackal Re-Range, or a Flash Pointer, or a Megabass Vision 110, those baits that you're hitting them hard, it's no issue. I mean, you can still pop them, no problem. It's that little bit of finesse that you have an issue with. So it just comes down to budget on your rod. And then I throw both braid with a mono leader and fluorocarbon. It's the same, honestly. This is one of those techniques where both work extremely well. On the braid, I feel the bite, it's more crisp. So if I've got fish up around cover, I go with braid with leader because I can lean on them harder if I need to. If I'm fishing open water, if I'm not around docks or around tules or around big rock, I'll go to fluoro because they eat it in that open water. You just bow up on them and just let them dig and wear themselves out. But if they can wrap you up in something, braid to leader, absolutely the way to go. But light braid, light leader. We're talking 15 to 20 pound braid tied to an 8 to 12 pound leader so that the line doesn't interfere with the action of the bait. Last but not least, I said we'd talk about soft jerk baits. We've done a ton of underwater footage with soft jerk baits. You already know how well they work. But seriously, the soft jerk bait, you can rig it two ways. One is you put a screw in the nose and then put a little wacky rig hook in there, finesse wide gap hook right in the nose of that bait. It's like the banjo minnow rigging essentially. Works incredibly well. You get a ton of action and you can throw that bait on light line. You can even throw it on a spinning rod when you get that little hook up there in the nose. And they eat it so well because when they eat a jerkbait, they eat it head first. So even though it's just nose hooked, you end up with that little hook back in their crushers almost every time. Works incredibly well. Otherwise, if I'm in around heavy cover, I'll rig it on a 4-aught. This is a Super Fluke. That's my favorite one to throw, Zoom Super Fluke. Cheap bait, but works incredibly well. And this is my #1 color, which is Smokin' Shad. I've thrown that thing since I was a kid. But I rig it on a Gamakatsu 4-aught EWG Superline. Not the light wire, the Superline, because it gets a little better fall out of it. And it's not jumping out of the water every time I work it. I can still get up on top and work it fast, but I can slow it down a lot easier with a Superline than I can with a standard hook. And you can throw it on stouter gear. You can throw it on all the way up to like a true jig rod. You know, a 7 up to a 7.6, medium heavy to heavy rod if you know you're gonna get big bites. The benefit of the soft jerkbait over a standard jerkbait is where you can put it. This I have to fish the edges of cover. This I can skip up under docks. I can throw it back over the grass beds into little open pockets of water into the cover and work it through. And I can throw it a much heavier line than you can the traditional jerkbait. That is the give and take of those two presentations. Both are deadly. Both get incredible reaction strikes. I mean, that hard jerkbait, that dirty action and that loud rattle just drives those fish insane. And that soft jerkbait in and around cover or fishing it up high over the top of those fish, they just come up and smash it. They can't handle it. It's a great 1-2 punch to throw in the springtime. Hope that helps you guys. That was a ton of gear to talk about. I will link everything down in the video description for you to make it really easy. We'll link the big jerkbaits that I really like, the tiny jerkbaits I like, and the soft baits, as well as some gear recommendations. But you gotta try it, guys. I mean, I don't know what else to say. There probably has never been a better bait ever designed to get a core reaction out of bass and to draw big fish up out of schools than a jerkbait. It flat works. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. We'll talk to you soon.